Sup guys, Bjorn here. I hope you're having a good day. Today we're taking a look at stats in World of Warcraft. So we're going to go through primary, secondaries, tertiaries, how to make sense of them all, which secondaries to go for in which situations, and also just what all of the stats do, obviously. At the end of the video, we're also going to take a look at some stat sims to help you guys make sense of how sims can look on a few different characters if you're into that. Before we get into the video, make sure you leave a like down below and maybe even consider subscribing, because I'm gonna be releasing a lot of new content coming into 9.1.5 and also the month after. Mostly educational, but there's also gonna be some entertaining stuff in there probably, so stay tuned guys. Without further ado, let's get straight into the video. We have primary stats starting off here, and these aren't very complicated at all. You have intellect, strength, and agility, right? And you just go for whichever your spec has. The game pretty much solves this for you. There is one thing to keep in mind here, and it is that different gear pieces have different values of primary, right? So you have, for example, trinkets, you have weapons. Those usually have a massive amount of primary on them, while as some slots, for example, necklaces and rings, they don't have any primary at all. And here you can see how different gear slots might contribute differently to your DPS, right? If primary is a really good thing for you, as it currently is in Shadowlands, then a main hand weapon with a lot of primary, or some good trinkets with a lot of primary, is obviously going to affect your DPS quite a bit. Now, primary isn't always as great as it is right now. For example, in Legion, it was valued a little bit lower. More people were going for like their best secondary stats, valuing that higher than their primary stats. And if primary is good, then that generally means that item level is good, right? If primary is good, then you should just go for the highest item level gear. While as if primary is worse than the secondaries, then you should maybe look at getting your biz stats over an item level gain. Currently in Shadowlands, however, primary is really good, so going for high item level is usually a good idea. Now we're going to move into the secondaries, and this is where it gets a little bit tricky, right? So we have 4 of them. We have Mastery, we have Critical Strike, Versatility, and Haste. And these are quite different. We're starting off with Mastery. Now, Mastery is obviously going to be a little bit tricky because it depends on your spec. So you're going to have to go on each individual spec and read your Mastery. Now, one thing to keep in mind is that there's usually some caveat to your Mastery, right? There's some form of percentage damage increase. Maybe you buff a specific part of your kit with this Mastery. And this is where you should be really careful, especially on like AoE versus single target, right? If your Mastery is mainly affecting your single target spells, then it might be pretty bad on AoE. And if it mainly affects your AoE abilities, then it might be pretty bad on single target. As a general rule, I think Mastery is usually a lot worse on AoE than it is on single target for a lot of specs, but obviously this is going to depend on a case-to-case basis. Just as an example, on my Survival Hunter, the Mastery is you increase your damage dealt by your focus spending abilities, and since my AoE abilities aren't focus spending, it's really useless on AoE. Next up is Critical Strike, and this is fairly straightforward. You just have a chance to deal 200% damage on any given spell, right? And this is nerfed to 175% damage in PvP to not make one-shots as reliable, I guess. Crit is pretty straightforward, as I said, since it just makes you crit more. There's no real interaction there. However, a lot of specs in the game have some form of crit scaling, right? The most prevalent example of this is probably the Fire Mage, where you will, if you crit with a spell, gain a stack to make your next Pyroblast instant, for example. So in that case, you obviously want to crit a lot. And now, most classes aren't going to have as big of a crit scaling as Fire Mage, but most of them have something little. For example, on my Hunter, I have Killshot, deals 250% damage with a crit instead of 200%. So there's that slight little advantage on Execute where crit is going to be valued a little bit higher than it should be. However, crit scaling on most classes aren't big enough to make like crit your by far best stat or anything. Versatility is an interesting stat because it makes you deal a certain amount of more damage, but it also makes you take less damage with half that number, right? And this means that it is pretty damn good in PvP, it makes you pretty tanky, and it's also a normalizing stat, kind of, which means that it's the same for everyone, right? If you think about versatility, you just deal a flat amount of more damage with everything, that's going to work the same for every single spec more or less. Now there have been some minor outliers here. Someone's probably going to nitpick with this, like for example some monk spells not working with versatility and stuff like that, but generally across most specs this is a normalizing stat that works the same for every single spec, and this is pretty important later on. As I said, it's also more or less the PvP stat, since you will become more tanky by picking this up. Then we're moving on to haste, and haste is by far the most complex stat, but even though it has like a ton of different things it impacts, it kind of sums itself up into a pretty neat package when you think about the whole stat, right? You decrease global cooldown for everything, right? Every single class in the game gets a decreased global cooldown from more haste, which means that you will in practice just play faster, right? Your spec will flow faster because you will be able to cram out more spells in the same amount of time. It decreases cooldowns for some classes. This is mostly for melee specs, like Survival Hunter, Fury Warrior, Havoc DH, stuff like that. But some of the range specs also get decreased cooldowns from haste. I think for example Shadow Priest does, and maybe some others. It also decreases cast times, so this is mostly prevalent for range specs, right? Casters that have 2-second cast times on their spells, they're gonna see a lot of benefit from haste there. It decreases the time between auto attacks for melee classes, and this is pretty minor, right? This is not gonna result in a huge DPS increase. It increases resource generation if you have like those ticking resources like energy, focus, or whatever. It also increases the tick rate of your dots and hots, and this is pretty important because a lot of hots and dot classes actually want haste. This does not work on bleeds, however, so that's why haste, for example, is pretty bad on Feral Druid, it's pretty bad on Assas Rogue, and stuff that has bleeds, because while on a ranged class with a magic dot, you will actually see a big benefit from haste, because when you apply that dot and you have a lot of haste, then instead of doing the damage faster in a shorter amount of time, the dot instead has the same duration as before, but it's gonna tick faster, it's gonna tick more times, right? So haste usually pretty good for those classes as well. Then we have the tertiaries, and these are pretty straightforward, right? You can just pick them up and they're gonna be pretty good. I have a little saying called leech is good for tanks and healers, speed is good for damage dealers, and avoidance is just really good altogether. This is most of a meme. I would say here, just anything you can pick up of these three is obviously going to be an upgrade. Avoidance is actually kind of good. I would say avoidance is good for everyone. Leech is also more or less good for everyone, but especially for tanks and healers. And speed is obviously just going to make you faster, so no big deal there. Okay, so let's actually just delve into how to make sense of these secondaries then, because these four stats here, Mastery, Crit, Verse, and Haste, are obviously the four that are going to impact your playstyle. They're going to impact your damage a lot. And you also have the choice between picking one of the four up, right? So you need kind of to know how they work. And the very first thing to understand about these secondary stats is that they work multiplicatively with each other, right? So if you have more of one, then the rest are going to become more effective. And I'll illustrate this here with just a simple little math example here. I'm sure you all remember this from primary school or whatever. You have a rectangle here, for example. So we can say that this rectangle is a 10 centimeter base here and a 6 centimeter height. Now let's pretend that this is your haste and your mastery, okay? So you have a haste value of 10 and a mastery value of 6. In order to get your DPS here, you would multiply haste with mastery to get the answer right, and this is currently 60. I can't write 60 apparently, but here we go. If you multiply those together, you'll get the area of the rectangle, aka 60 centimeters, aka 60 DPS. If you, however, instead were to draw up a square here, and this amount of stat is still the same, right? So we still have a total of 16 here, 8 and 8, 10 and 6. But this time, when we multiply them, you can see that the value is actually more than before, right? So what this essentially is telling you is that if your stats are close together, if your values of your stats are close together and you multiply them, then you'll get a bigger result, right? You'll get a bigger area of this rectangle here. And this essentially means that the more of mastery you have, for example, the better all of the other 3 stats are going to become. And here, I'm obviously only drawing in 2 dimensions, right, with 2 stats. If you want a complete picture of how this looks in WoW, you would need to add 2 more This is where my English skills fall down. Axis? 1 axis, 2 axi? I have no idea. You would need to add 2 axi, maybe. I'm just gonna fucking put it out there, whatever. 1 for versatility and 1 for crit, right? And in that case, the difference between the area of this 10-6 relationship and the 8-8 is going to be even bigger, right? When you add dimensions, this difference is going to become even more significant. And this essentially means that your stat priorities are going to shift all the time, right? Because as soon as you get a little bit more haste, then the value of your crit, of your mastery, of your verse is going to increase. Which means that you want to pick up mastery next, or crit next, or verse next if you have a lot of haste, and vice versa. So the problem with this is, right, that if you want to figure out which your best stat is, and you put on a piece of gear, well, that itself is going to change all of your stat priorities, because you're gaining a little bit of one secondary stat, you're losing a little bit of another. And this is also why simming stat weights on raid bots that we're going to do later is a really bad idea, because the stat weights have this exact problem, where the weights will shift depending on how much or how little of a stat you gain. In addition to that, all of these 4 stats have vastly different values for different specs, right? So not only do you have to take into account how much of each stat you currently have, but you also have to take into account how much value that single stat has for you personally. And this is where simming is by far the best thing, right? If you're simming gear upgrades, if you're simming top gear or anything like that, you will reliably know which stat or which gear piece is actually good for you. But that is also pretty much the only way to do it reliably. Now, once you start understanding the stats better, once you play around with them, you will also create somewhat of an intuitive feel for these stats, right? You will know which stats are good on which specs just by reading the abilities, by reading the scalings. But even then, they can also be very deceptive sometimes. Generally, in order to determine if a stat is good for your class, you should look at a couple of different things, right? So haste is usually always pretty damn good for casters, first of all. And when it comes to the melees, you will, if you've played a lot of specs, you'll already probably have a feel for that some melee specs are slow and some are fast, right? And this usually has to do with haste. If your melee spec doesn't like haste, then it's obviously going to play slow, because no one is going to play haste on that class. So examples of this is, for example, Windwalker is a pretty slow melee class, doesn't have any haste. Same with Feral Druid, Arms Warrior, stuff like that. The other ones are a bit more tricky. Critical Strike is usually pretty good for you if you have some sort of crit scaling in the class, but it's also due to the multiplicative nature of these 4 stats that we talked about previously. It's obviously gonna be pretty damn good in most scenarios for most classes, because it doesn't really have a big downside, right? When you think about crit, the upside is pretty small. You can just crit for double damage, but the downside is also negligible, right? There is pretty much no downside with crit. This is the complete opposite with mastery, right? Because depending on your spec here, depending on your spec's mastery, your benefit from this can vary wildly, right? We have some classes where it only affects half of their kit, some classes where it does something really weird. For example, Elemental Shaman's Mastery, pretty damn horrible, just because of how weird the interaction is. So here, your only option is probably either to read your mastery and see if it seems good yourself, or more reliably just like check a guide or run a sim. Versatility is in many ways the very most interesting stat in my opinion, because this is obviously going to do the pretty much the same for every spec as we talked about before. This actually has some pretty nasty implications. Something else to keep in mind with especially haste, it's something called breakpoints. Now, a breakpoint is basically a specific point at which, when you have that amount of stat or over, you will reach a certain breakpoint in your rotation, right? So it could be, for example, that you get an extra ability into a cooldown window, or whatever it could possibly be. There is some form of breakpoint where before that value you want the stat, and after that value you don't want the stat. Most prevalently, this has been the case with haste before, because of these like tick rates where you can get in an extra tick before the dot ends. But Blizzard has actively combated this, and now there's, for example, something called partial ticks to dots to not make haste breakpoints such a big thing for dot classes. But breakpoints are still a thing for some specs with different stats, mostly haste. A good example would be BFA Fire Mage, for example, with crit. Something else to keep in mind when thinking about these stats is that you won't only have stats from your gear, right? You'll also have some stats from soulbinds, maybe cooldowns, maybe pots, maybe externals, whatever it could be, right? And those stats are obviously gonna impact this dynamic multiplicative nature of the stats, right? Because if, for example, you get a 30% haste buff from Bloodlust, well, then Mastery, Crit, and Verse is obviously going to be a lot better to have in that window. Similarly, if you have a haste cooldown on your spec already, then maybe these other stats are better, and vice versa. For example, on my Survival Hunter, I have the Resonating Arrow with Kyrian, which gives me a 30% crit chance on everything. That indirectly raises the priority of all of the other stats, right? So if I already know that I have something like that, that gives me a lot of crit, then maybe going for more of one of the other stats is going to be more valuable. This is also the case with trinkets, and trinkets is where this is mostly used, right? There's a ton of unused trinkets that give you a good amount of a certain stat on use, and that can drastically shift your stat priority if you are a cooldown reliant class. Because think about what it means to be a cooldown reliant class, right? That means that you will do most of your damage in this specific window in your cooldowns. If you do most of your damage in that window, that means that temporary stat buffs are going to be super strong, right? Because if you can just temporarily shift your stats a little bit upwards during that moment, then that's going to be a lot better than having like a small amount of stat over the entire fight. And that means that unused trinkets are usually very good for these cooldown classes. Now, unused trinkets can only give one of four of these stats normally, right? You have the Blood Ruby, for example, giving crit. You have IQD giving one of your highest stats. You have the Divine Bell from the World Crest giving mastery for those pesky balance druids, for example. So if you have one of those unused trinkets, then that stat might actually shift a lot lower in priority. For example, on my Demonology Warlock, I have the Blood Ruby, which gives me 1000 crit when I use it. And since pretty much all of my damage comes in my Tyrant window on my Demonology Warlock, and I get an extra 1000 crit in that window every single time, that means that obviously Mastery, Haste, and Verse are suddenly going to become a lot more useful, since suddenly, if I get 1000 crit, how that looks here on the shape is just like a very, very skewed rectangle, right? When I pop my Tyrant and I have this long amount of crit here from the Ruby, but I only have a tiny amount of haste, I would get a lot of value from increasing my haste to a more uniform shape here, right? To a larger area. One more thing is that Blizzard in Shadowlands introduced a thing called Diminishing Returns on stats, meaning that above 30%, it's going to be diminishing returns. So if you have more than 30%, I wrote that sign the wrong way, right? If you have more than 30% stat, you're going to have diminishing returns on that stat, which means that it will obviously drop a little bit in value. If you don't know what diminishing returns means, it's basically just that once you reach 30%, every single point of stat after that is going to be a little bit less useful, and it's going to become less and less useful the higher you gain in that stat. Now, this is not affected by stuff like flat percent values, right? So Bloodlust, for example, gives 30% flat haste. This is not going to care about your diminishing returns value at all. You're just going to get a flat 30% haste on top of whatever you have, and you won't see any decrease because of diminishing returns. However, diminishing returns will kick in if you get a stat value buff, right? So that would, for example, be Blood Ruby. Blood Ruby says it gives 1167 crit or whatever. Then that 1167 crit, once applied to you, is obviously on your character sheet gonna get converted into a percentage value as well. But it's not a flat percentage like the Bloodlust haste, right? It doesn't just add on top of whatever you have. Suddenly it will start messing with that diminishing returns, right? Another very, very crucial thing about stats is that they fundamentally define how you scale, right? Because what it fundamentally means to scale well is to gain a large amount of DPS from your gear, right? Think about this. Every single tier, you're gonna get a little bit higher item level. There's gonna be new gear coming out with more primary, with more secondaries on it, and you're gonna get that gear, right? And that gear is gonna increase your DPS by a margin. Now, if you scale well, this means that the gear is gonna increase your DPS by a lot. If you scale poorly, it means that this extra stat from the gear is gonna increase your damage by just a tiny bit. And remember what I said about versatility being a normalizing stat before? This is gonna become really useful now. So think about versatility. It does the same for pretty much every single spec in the game. It just increases your damage by a flat amount. Well, you can now go to your stat priority. You can look, and maybe you'll see that versatility is your best stat, right? There's not a ton of specs in the game that has this currently, but let's just pretend it for the sake of the argument. Versatility is your best stat. Now, what does this mean, really? Well, the stats are all just relative to each other, right? So if versatility is your best stat, that just means, since versatility is a normalizing stat, right? That means that all of the other stats are kind of bad for you if verse is your best stat. Now, if verse is bad for you, on the other hand, then that means that all of the other stats are actually good by comparison. So if verse is your best stat, then you're going to gain a small amount of DPS from mastery, you're going to get a small amount of DPS from crit, you're going to get a small amount of DPS from haste, in comparison, since verse is the same for everyone. Well, that fundamentally means that you scale poorly, right? Because you're getting a relatively lower amount of DPS from mastery, crit, and haste, depending on, or compared to verse. Now, if verse is your worst stat, on the other hand, then that means that you will be getting a relatively large increase from crit, mastery, and haste compared to verse. And verse is the same for everyone, remember? So this means fundamentally that you scale well, right? The next tier, you're gonna get a good amount of mastery, a good amount of crit, a good amount of haste, and a good amount of verse. And since verse is the normalizing bar, it's here, but your mastery, crit, and haste is above it, then yeah, you're gonna gain a lot of DPS. While as for another spec who has verse as their best stat, then verse is the bar here, and haste, mastery, and crit are down here. Well, then you're obviously not going to gain as much DPS. So then, what can actually change up your stat priority? And this can be a lot of different things, right? First of all, you should probably be looking at single target versus AoE. There are a ton of different specs that have different stat priorities on single target versus AoE. If you read your mastery, it's usually the biggest contributor to this, because mastery tends to shift a lot between single target and AoE. The value of haste, verse, and crit usually stays about the same, but because of the dynamic stat profile of the stats, they can obviously also shift quite a lot, and it also depends from spec to spec. Your stat priorities can also shift drastically if you switch up your talent builds, for example. Some talent builds might be very, very heavy into haste, some might be very, very heavy into mastery or crit. For example, on my Havoc DH, you would like maybe a little bit more crit if you're playing momentum, a little bit more mastery if you're playing demonic, And if you're playing the raid set with the frost domination shards, then you would obviously want full crit all of a sudden. So there can be definitely some different things that switch on the priority. Usually if you do a lot of PvP, versatility is going to be your best stat. On my demo lock, haste is always going to be really strong, but crit, as I mentioned before, is going to get a bit DR'd from that blood ruby. So you might think, okay, then mastery is probably my second best stat, since I scale well. That means that verse is probably my worst one. Well, I also get a decent amount of mastery from my Naya soulbind, actually, from Nightfey. So I already run a lot of haste. I get crit from my trinket. I get mastery from my soulbind. Well, even though verse is my worst stat on paper, it actually does increase quite a bit in value here because of that multiplicative scaling, right? So don't just take your stat priority at face value. Do actually think about all of these different systems that also impact your stats. Howdy fellas, Bjorn from the future here. I am bringing you 2 quick sims here. And first I've simmed my little warlock here with my normal gear, all of the stuff that I usually have, and the trinkets are infinitely divisible ooze and soul-letting ruby. So with this build we can clearly see that haste is valued as my highest stat, below intellect obviously, and raid bots themselves do actually also point out down here that they are not very accurate. They say that if you add 116 intellect to your character, each point would add an average of 3.36 DPS, but it doesn't guarantee necessarily that 1 intellect is exactly this amount of DPS, right? So essentially what they've done here is that they've added 116 of every stat, and they've then compared the DPS values, and then they've averaged those values out over 1 stat instead of 116. But this ignores breakpoints, right? And this is where this falls short pretty heavily, because if you increase your stat by 116, you might go over a breakpoint, you might not quite hit the breakpoint, or whatever it could be. For example, if we add 116 haste and our character gets right up to the next haste breakpoint, then, well, this is going to value haste pretty highly, right? Because 116 haste up to that value is very efficient if we just reach it. On the other hand, if we were to add 116 haste and we did not quite reach that breakpoint, then the value is going to be almost meaningless, right? Because you're going to lose a ton of that haste for not reaching the breakpoint. This obviously varies from spec to spec, but you get my general point here. So I figured, hey, haste is my highest stat on the sim, right? What if I swapped out my ooze for a ocular gland? And this is obviously going to give me haste, because haste is my highest stat here on this character. So we can see here clearly that a few things happen between the sims. My intellect value actually increased from this sim to this sim, and this might be explained from the simple fact that I lost a little bit of intellect here, right? If you look at my ooze, it has 93 intellect because it's a higher item level. I equipped my 239 ocular gland. Now I lose 6 intellect. So intellect is valued a little bit higher because I have less of it now. The opposite is true at haste, right? I gained quite a lot of haste while I equipped the ocular gland. So my haste value went down from 275 to 259. Regardless, this stat weight here is not something I usually recommend you guys sim. If you want to sim, I recommend you to select the specific gear piece that you're wondering about, like is this an upgrade, is this not an upgrade, and then you go to top gear or gear compare or whatever you prefer using, and you just check if that specific gear piece is an upgrade for you. If you just want to check like your DPS stuff, you can also run quick sims as a starting point. Alright guys, that was it for my stat guide. I hope you enjoyed this discussion. I hope you learned something. If you have any comments, if you want to point out some mistakes I made, feel free to leave that in the comment section. Also, I would very much appreciate it if you subscribed and liked the video maybe even, because I'm going to be releasing a ton of new content over the next couple of weeks. Otherwise, I hope you have a great day. Bye bye guys.